you earlier said that the Pope didn't have the concepts.
Or if you asked him what he knows in his heart versus what he can say to the people. Okay, in the Old Testament, you have the Hebrew people and the author of the Torah ascribing to Yahweh the doing of everything that happens pretty much, crediting him with everything from, the disease that struck to the scorpions to whatever, okay? The army lost, and therefore, Yahweh made the Now, does that contradict divine justice? On the surface, yes. But what's the deeper meaning? In that time, with the concepts they had, the language that they had, which God respects, he uses what's there. Now,
so there's no jumping the cheese, to put it.
No jumping the cheese. What did they have available in their toolkit to describe certain states of affairs? The Old Testament isn't monotheistic. I need to use the term monolatrous, which means
early on.
Torah, whatever, very early. Not monotheistic, monolatrous. There's, probably a bunch of gods, but we worship the best one. So, based on the state of mind of the people, how is God revealing himself? Well, he's doing what's reported, but they're taking it in terms of the structures that they have. Let's say there are two buckets, okay? Really only two. There's Yahweh did it, and he gets the credit. He's worthy of the worship. Or Baal and some of his cohorts. One of those two things. Some entity is behind whatever happens. So if we say Yahweh didn't do this, but the ark fell on you because it just fell on you, we're really saying Baal has power over Yahweh. And we're therefore offending the honor due to Yahweh. Therefore, they relentlessly say Yahweh did it. It's a form of devotion. Catechism directly addresses it. It says it's not merely a primitive form of expression, but a way of honoring the power of God and the worthiness of God. Right? In their minds, they're saying Baal gets the credit, and he has power, and it's an insult to Yahweh. Now, flash forward to medieval times. Thomas More, before being executed, something to the extent of, don't worry, nothing can happen but what God wills. So, be at peace. Seems to, on the face of it, impute God as being responsible for evil. Nothing can happen but what God wills it. So if I get unjustly condemned for a crime and killed, it's God's will. He likes this. It's the way it ought to have been. I can rejoice and not be afraid of the executioner. Okay. What is he saying? Is he really saying that God likes evil? Okay, Thomas, does God like sin? No, but nothing can happen but what God wills, right? Okay, is God willing my sin? Well, no, of course not. So you mean something different than what it seems that you mean and what a lot of people mistake you for saying. What he's saying is that and he didn't have the way to express this in a soundbite before he was being executed. The redemption is so efficacious that no matter what happens, no matter how evil it is, we can trust that God will not let loss and evil have any power to diminish. Okay? Because of the redemption, not because the evil is really good. That's the teaching of the church. But on the face of it, the language seems to say, don't worry about evil, it's not so bad. And in fact, God is behind it. But the language is limited. So, for Thomas More and his associates there, if he were to entertain, if he were to say, oh, God is infinitely opposed to those being unfairly killed here, that seems to be saying that God doesn't have power, that God isn't truly sovereign, that God hasn't accounted for everything and bringing it into a master plan, that everything is not integrated, that evil has real power. Now, it's the same thing as the Israelites and Baal. Honoring God. Thomas More. If we don't say that everything is God's will, we're saying that the devil has power that God hasn't accounted for. Same thing. We have more buckets, in the medieval times. We have philosophy, we have science beginning. More buckets, more explanatory power. But not enough buckets, not enough category. But it's better than the Torah. Okay, but the Torah is still inspired. It's still the same revelation of what God is doing. Okay? God is showing forth who he is to an evil, drawing people out of evil and deception. Now, modern times, we still have the same medieval language. And we're trying to answer questions that are not medieval questions. Okay? And people are getting more and more upset, and the answers don't make sense, really. And even though the apologists can make them more complicated and louder and make better videos and things like that, they still don't make sense, and people know it. And the atheists' points do make sense, because they're actually true. These things really are evil, and they shouldn't be ignored. Okay? That helps us, really, from an authentic Catholic perspective, because the authentic interpretation of the faith, and this is in the Catechism, the faith is a response to the problem of evil in its rawest form, the kind of evil that is depicted on a crucifix. That's innocent suffering of the most gruesome form imaginable. That's where the faith starts. Right? It's a response to that kind of suffering, the kind of suffering that turns a person into a piece of meat. Now, we don't have the language to talk about that truth if we only have the medieval language, which is, don't worry, nothing happens but what God wills. Okay? There's truth in that we're not to ignore. Namely, everything is perfectly integrated. All right? The devil doesn't have power. It's all transformed into Christ. All right? So no matter what happens, don't worry. God is willing it in the sense that he's the receiver of it as the crucified. And he can take those wounds and give them a future. All right? So he's saying yes to it in himself. It's perfectly in his will. How can he make it so that I'm well? How can he make it so that everything I've ever done, though it's just a pile of sin, has been the most perfect thing that could have been done? That's what he said. Okay? How can he make what's not his will into his will? He took it all to himself, received the effects of all my sin, saying yes to it from eternity, as if he had never, no, rather, without considering any alternative of how it could have been otherwise. This is the only reality, what I contributed to, and he made that his will. Okay, he said yes to it from all eternity, and gave that a future. Didn't entertain anything else. Had I not sinned last week, he doesn't consider it. If he had considered it for 1 second and compared one against the other, we couldn't be saved. He only said yes from all eternity, the lamb slain from the foundation of the world, to make me clean. So, the language. There are categories. There are categories of thought. What do I mean by categories of thought? I'll give you a very clear example. And this proves itself. You don't have to believe what I say. You can see it for yourself. The question of the problem of evil, once again. Classical theism. God is omnipotent. God is omniscient, all-powerful, all-knowing. God is omnibenevolent, all good. And yet, there's evil. Okay? The only way that we've been able to reconcile those things is to say, well, there's some good reason why there's evil. Okay? Some morally exonerating principle that gets God off the hook. So he's all-powerful, all-knowing, and perfectly good, and there's evil because God has a reason. All right. Now, that's consistent. That avoids a genuine contradiction between those divine attributes. Because he could have a reason. Even if we don't know what it is, he could have a reason. And so that's been such that we can defend against critics who are using that argument. We don't have to know what the reason is. Okay, now, what if we say, though, God is all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good, there's evil in the world, and, now here's the catch thing here. This is the thing that seems to be a logical black hole. And he's infinitely opposed to every evil with the fullness of his power, without holding back one bit. Okay. Doesn't it seem, from a philosophical perspective, that I should be taken to the hospital? 911, maybe? Why? Because look at the world. If he's perfectly opposed to it, he would be a little bit more successful given having omnipotence and omniscience and...
Right, he could prevent things that are going to happen that are bad.
Yeah. So it's so obvious it appears so obviously to be a vacuum. Like there's no logical space there. There's no way that
it's a giant leap.
No, it's not even a leap. It's a contradiction. So it seems. It seems like there's no way that option could have any viability whatsoever. None. And it seemed that way so clearly that no one has ever considered it. All right? Instead, all of the considerations on the problem of evil, all of them, without exception, have been in terms of there is some reason God is not doing everything that he could do, okay? He's not perfectly opposed to evil. Now, he's against it because he's good, but it's useful for a purpose. The smallpox, it's working towards the greater good. It's all working towards the greater good, therefore he doesn't stop it.
So hold on, what about St. Aquinas and St. Augustine and all these folks who...
I'll get to it.
Oh, okay.
I'll get to it. So, but answering your question,
But
the
yes.
language. No one has looked into that category of perfect opposition. It has not been investigated because it seems, at first glance, ridiculous. And every smart person who has done philosophy has said, oh, well, it can't be that. All right, so let's move on to what it could be. So there's something else that's short of perfect opposition given. And therefore, there's a mix between good and evil. We're calling evil good and good evil, and we don't even know it. I publish stuff saying evil is a necessary means to a good end, and we don't know what's going on, but that's the way it is, and I would win the argument because the other person couldn't say that I was necessarily wrong. So the language. I mean categories that are not available in the normal thought structures because they seem impossible. Okay. And they're not impossible. They're actually very simple and totally overlooked universally in the entire endeavor of theology. However, and this is the second part of the point, the Pope and Father Cantalamessa, they are on the trail, and they're trying to say this. So they're only able to say what's not so. They're not able to say this because the perfect opposition model, it can't be expressed credibly until you have all of the data. For example, talking about evil working towards a purpose without being very careful about what you're saying conflates the redemption and the natural world of evil, okay, as being one and the same thing, and this directly coming from God's hand, as if he's the author of evil. Now, this makes God unjust, and people know it, and therefore they criticize, saying, this is really awful. Christopher Hitchens was right. We have something to learn from him on this. Not about everything he said, of course, but on this, he was absolutely right, prophetic even. Okay? What drives him, or drove him, to say the things that he said needs to be integrated into the Catholic faith seamlessly and even amplified. His was a diminished version, but they thought that that separated them from God. Okay? That's what everyone thinks. This anger separates me from God. No, it doesn't. It's the thing that's connecting me to him much more than religion is.
When the Pope was in Germany recently, just before he left Germany, he made a statement that agnostics who are genuinely seeking truth are closer to the kingdom of God than like lukewarm or indifferent believers. Yeah, I mean, directly speaking to this point.
I've verified that in my own life. I find that with this understanding of evil and God's goodness, I have more in common spiritually. And this isn't a blanket statement, it's not absolute, but I have more in common spiritually with agnostics and with atheists because we have the same starting point. This thing which is driving you crazy, that you don't have to renounce for the sake of pleasing God. No, this is the way God sees it. You're right. We religious folk have ignored just how bad the suffering is. Now, that's not saying that everybody religious has nothing to say. No, not at all. But there's something that's very necessary for being human and being like God that they're in touch with. Most religious people are not. And if a religious person does become in touch with it, they feel that, oh, this is really going to contradict my faith. It's like, this is too much. I cannot go along with this. I cannot love an order of things. And the architect behind that, where a child is put to torture, it's not lovable. And I thought I could overlook that, but I can't. And it just got bigger and bigger and bigger, and it got bigger than me. And then Ninth Revelation went to communion, and find that it's the Lord's view. This is how he sees it. It's like, whoa, all right, this thing that I thought was separating me irrevocably from God is really God.
So, let's say for the abortion, there's this kind of sense among Catholics is that God at some point will. The question is, how long is he going to endure it before he does?
Before his divine hand, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So, I want to ask you if you think that
I'm so delighted that you asked.
position is
Or
wrong.
are we reaping the fruit of that
Is that
already?
position wrong? And then if it's wrong, then would it be the same as Peter? And remember when he chopped off the ear? Because Peter wanted Jesus to react and strike back, and Jesus said, "No, I'm not going to strike back. I'm going to go this way."
It's already been defined by the church. Part of the Fatima message. When you see a night illumined, that this is the great sign given you by God that he is about to punish the world for its crimes by means of war, persecution of the church, and the Holy Father.
We're in it.
Okay? That's part of the message of Fatima. A pretty well-substantiated product, by the way. This is almost universally misunderstood. How has the church, Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith? On the contrary, it is people themselves who are preparing their own punishment.
Right.
In his kindness, God warns us and calls us to the right path, while respecting the freedom he has given us. Hence, people are responsible. And the Catechism explicitly defines something that is very much in line with that. And before I tell you what the Catechism says, I'll read something from Father Hardham, a relatively famous catechist and teacher, of the, highly revered, and maybe even up for a canonization, I think. Okay, Father Hardham. God's response to sin we call punishment. Now, there are two kinds of punishment that God inflicts. They are punitive and what we call remedial. Punitive punishment, which sounds like needless repetition but is not, means that God punishes sin in order to, inflict suffering or pain where the person had offended God by indulging himself against the will of God. If sin is against the will of God, pain is against the will of man. It's all that simple. Moreover, God punishes, as we say, remedially, that is, he inflicts pain indeed, but not precisely or primarily in order to make up for the indulgence by a creature against God's will, but in order to bring the sinner back to God. That's someone who's really into teaching the Catholic faith, though. He believes this. Now, Father Hardin is unmistakable. God does this to hurt you on purpose, either for vengeance or for remedy. Now, what does the Catechism say about this? A sure norm for teaching the faith, authoritative doctrine. Okay. Catechism says, these two punishments, eternal and temporal, must not be conceived as a kind of vengeance inflicted by God from without, namely what Father Hardin says, must not be conceived, but as following from the very nature of sin.
That's right.
There you go.
Catechism of the Catholic Church. Done, end of it. No more question about what the Church said. Now, Father Cantalamessa said in a homily that was addressed to the Pope, so the Pope was there, he didn't run out, sat through it and approved, said, to say that God sends natural disasters is an offense to God and to humanity. A lot of Catholics say that God sends natural disasters that strike the innocent and guilty. Now,
And nearly all
It
Protestants.
says calamity happens.
Oh, yeah.
It says calamity happens to the righteous and the unrighteous. But it doesn't
Spirit
say
daily?
send it.
Spirit daily, that's really mostly their whole message is
Right.
natural disasters, what's coming, and how to prepare. And pray that it doesn't happen to you. Now, it's not just false. It's not just a mistake. It's an offense to God and to humanity. It's blasphemous and it's anti-human. It's evil. Now, I'm not saying the people are evil who are afflicted by this view, but the view is an evil view. Not on purpose, but in fact, you're reading about a pagan deity and what he's going to do. The real God isn't like that.
That's right.
Even in theory, even in potential, can't entertain doing evil to people. And the fact that that's the focus of Spirit Daily is really awful. The abomination of desolation is it in the sanctuary. It's like, what's gone on to get us away from God being good? or even on guilty people. He even says he doesn't do it for guilty people. But now, Father Cantalamessa said this to the Pope. The Pope implicitly agrees. I can just see it intuitively. There has to be clear theodicy, a clear way of talking about the problem of evil in new language. And so we, as a church, have always believed that suffering is redemptive. Right? And we're not going to let go of that. So we can't therefore say, well, suffering is evil and God is totally against it. How can both be true? Right? So we're looking for a theory that reconciles them. So too, the church is trying to be able to say how evil suffering is in itself, how evil is in all its forms, and how effective the redemption is, such that all of our sufferings are now infinitely meaningful. Not to say that suffering is good, but it's not meaningless. So, okay, how do we hold those two things together? We don't know yet. This is the equivalent of reconciling general relativity and quantum mechanics. I don't know if that analogy helps enough, but we can talk about both things at once now. God is perfectly opposed to every evil. Every instance of innocent suffering is the object of divine wrath for the sake of the person suffering. Fullness of his holiness, he reacts to it, as Father Cantalamessa says. Now, at the same time, the Pope says, give to God the sickness and sufferings that you endure, and you will be the means of redemption and purification of the whole world. Okay. Now, notice what the other denominations are doing. They're reacting from one position or the other. So, lots of people talk about suffering and how it's good for us and how it can be redemptive even, and so on. Well, prosperity gospel forms as a reaction to that. No, God wants me to be well. He doesn't want me to suffer. He doesn't want me to be sick. Are you crazy? He wants me to be healthy. And in fact, if I'm obedient to him, I'm going to be healthy. I'm not going to get sick. You're sick because you don't love God. Okay. Well, what are they doing? They're trying to hold on to the goodness of God, but they're creating a disaster also by ignoring
him stuff, right?
Yeah. But there's a truth in that they're holding on to. Yep. They know that God doesn't want them to be sick. Now, on the opposite side, you have John Piper, Calvinist. God loves suffering so much that it's really all about suffering. In fact, he made the world the way it is so that he could come and suffer it. He wanted it this way. If you have cancer, God did it. Okay. Total response of rejection to the prosperity gospel and its mistakes. How can you take those two things and take the thing that motivates the prosperity people and the thing that motivates John Piper to oppose them and put them together in one thing where God doesn't want me to be sick, God doesn't want me to be poor, God, okay, he wants me to be whole, well, beautiful, everything. But everything is part of this infinitely meaningful significance. So, in the deposit of faith, the doctrine affirms radically both that God wanted us to be well in every way, and that our sufferings are infinitely meaningful. In our teaching and preaching, we don't know how to make those two hang together, so we talk about one or the other, or we don't talk about much at all. Really, I've only heard the Pope talk about these things in a way that doesn't make the mistake of confusing one with the other, or diminishing one against the other. And when someone like Father Karapi, well-intentioned, wants to emphasize redemptive suffering, he does it at the expense of God wanting us to be well. Because that got into me really, really deep, that image of God. And God had to practically kill me to get it out. Because, it was so in there, I didn't know, and this is a representative of the church. Okay, so it became
problematic.
I accepted
authority
it.
Of the church.
I accepted it into myself unquestioningly and checked my own thought out against what he was saying because he represents the church. Who's more orthodox than him, right? And so, doesn't anyone know that he's not orthodox at this point still? I took it into myself and it became like my own organs, and they had to be taken out and replaced with real things. But I didn't want them to go out because it's like I'm losing my faith, right? And that's what part of the story is. It's like, God showing me what he's really like, contra what these teachers are saying God is like. So we make a mistake where when we talk about one thing and try to say the one thing, we implicitly say something against the other thing that we need to say just as loudly as the first thing. One aspect of the truth at the expense of all the other aspects. But that's not Catholic. Catholic is all truth, all at once, unified, beautiful, and good. And the prosperity gospel people don't have to give up their knowledge that God is really looking out for them. They might have to give up the Mercedes, but the notion that God wants me to be healthy, that's true. That's true. And the notion that my suffering is infinitely meaningful, that's true, too. And it is that way in Catholic doctrine, but the Catholics don't believe that they can say both at once, and so they hush up one or the other.